So our special guest today is William Gray. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So can you talk about yourself and tell us how you got started writing horror?
Yeah, so my journey with horror, of course, starts with Stephen King. I think that's pretty much everybody. I mean, I grew up on Goosebumps with R.L. Stein, which is also, I think, a prerequisite for most people writing horror. But that was my big one. And so I always wanted to write, and I really just didn't get it off the ground. I would get imposter syndrome, that kind of deal. And so I spent my adolescence and my early 20s kind of dabbling with different things, but not really doing anything with it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with me, so my debut, The Man Behind the Door, is actually based a little bit on my dad, and inadvertently my past a little bit as well. A huge motivation for me becoming a writer in general, what finally got me on this path was I decided to write a story about my dad. My dad had a lot of trouble throughout life, and that kind of had a trickle down effect with the family that he created with my mother and me.
Yeah.
And I had a really turbulent home life as a teenager, and I actually ended up in foster care. And I have no regrets about anything because it's made me who I am. But I didn't I gave up on writing. I didn't think that I had it in me, and it wasn't until the moment that I discovered the story that I felt like I needed to tell, which is my dad's story, that I managed to do that. And so that's how I got officially into writing horror, was actually kind of putting my dad's story through the lens of a ghost story. And
Yeah.
that started the whole thing. But separate from writing, I'm a lead pharmacy technician at an independent pharmacy in Virginia, which is in the United States. And that's my day job. I work there 40 hours a week minimum. I come home. I've got a family. I've got an awesome, incredible wife that is so supportive. And honestly, without her, I never would have been a published author. She is 100% the reason that I am out there and published and in the public, because she believed in my work in a way that even I didn't. And so we've got two kids. One of them is my bonus kid. I met him when he was one, and then we just had a baby girl actually 2 months ago today, which is crazy. So
Congratulations.
thank you.
Girls are harder.
That's what I hear, but so far so good. But I've only got 2 months of experience. We'll wait until she can start talking, right?
Yeah, definitely girls are harder. So enjoy that. Okay, so walk us through the process of where you get your ideas from.
Got you. So that's for the most part, my ideas come from, at least my novel ideas are inspired at least a little bit by real life. So I touched on my debut, which is really focused on my dad. Without that motivation, I never would have written that novel. And I think that is 100% the backbone that novel stands on. For The Devil
Yeah.
Within Us All, which came out via Wicked House Publishing earlier this year, I drew inspiration from real life again. I was really inspired by the ugliness we've seen in humanity in the last like 10 years, like 7-8 years kind of deal. um I there's been a lot of turbulent things in the world, and we've seen some people bring out the worst in others, and that was a really strong inspiration for Devil Within Us All. And so I ran with that. So they're two radically different books, which is funny because Man Behind the Door tackles some really tough subject matter, but there's this underlying current of hope, whereas with Devil Within Us All, it's largely pessimistic. The good guys in that book have a really bad time and have a difficult time succeeding. For my third book, I've kind of returned back to being inspired by my dad a little bit. We used to go on camping trips, and so I wanted to kind of tell a story where the underlying theme is mental illness among men, and especially older men, and the stigma that asking for help is something that makes us weak, or that we cannot do because it will make us weak. And so I was inspired by that. So I built a little bit of a creature feature around this theme. And while I don't think the theme is quite as clear as it is with Devil Within Us All and The Man Behind the Door, my upcoming novel, which is called Our Father's Burden and will be out in February if everything lines up, is very much a story about just good people that do bad things and are, struggling with their own issues. So for the most part, I pull from, from real life, what I witnessed, that kind of deal. I
Yeah.
started writing more short fiction, and so usually with my shorter fiction, I'm inspired by various things that I see. It can be something as, straightforward as direct media. I watch this and I'm like, wow, this is a really cool idea that's kind of congruent with this or kind of adjacent to it. Let's run with it. But for the most part, I usually draw like an idea from something else that's less direct. So right now I'm working on a short story that is inspired by my time as an Amazon delivery driver a little bit, and the feeling of uncertainty that can come when you're driving in the middle of nowhere. So that's been fun to work on. But for the most part, it's stuff, like I said, inspired by real life or inspired by other media, or even just a feeling that I get from a certain direct experience, I guess I should say.
Brilliant. So a lot of authors say the same thing, that they draw from around the experiences around them and things like that. So yeah, that's fantastic. So how do you, I know you mentioned about a couple of your characters. So how do you go about creating compelling characters?
Usually I usually come up with my main character, or at least my main character's motivations or direct conflict, something along those lines that is a strong underlying current for my main character. And from there I kind of branch out. I build characters around them. Because a lot of times I found, and this was one of my earliest pitfalls, is that I would come up with a story, and I developed the story so much that I would just try to force these different characters into them, and they didn't really have much life in them. And I've kind of pivoted that since telling my dad's story. The experience that I had writing those characters really altered my way of thinking. And so I'll come up with a concept or an idea, but from there I'll think, what kind of character is going to find themselves in this situation?
Yeah.
And what can I make about them that is compelling to the average reader? A superhero in a horror novel is not going to sell, kind of deal. I think that one of my biggest things is I hate plot armor in novels for the most part. That your main character is going to survive through the whole book for the most part. And that's true most of the cases it is, but I like to make them, I like to give them some kind of weakness or some kind of fallacy that makes them a little bit more human, more realistic, and makes them relatable to the average reader. I find that when I'm reading horror novels, more often than not, I never relate to the main character, of course, because they're facing these horrible, terrible things. I'm relating to them because of their subplots. They're small, real world issues that they're trying to battle through, and that they resolve throughout the novel, or they don't, they come to terms with it. And so that's where I start with my main characters, and from there I kind of build the related characters based on that. Devil Within Us All was a little bit different. It is a huge cast. I pretty much worked on the cast before I worked on anything major plot wise, and it was a different experience. And I don't know that I want to ever work with a cast that large again. I was directly inspired by the novels that I grew up with, Stephen King's The Stand, Dean Koontz, all those guys that that wrote classic horror. The vibe is very much classic 80s 90s horror in that novel, and it has a huge cast because of that. And so and also the subject matter kind of forces me to have a large cast too. I take the whole world's problem with having the worst brought out into them and compress it into this small town. So I needed a lot of people to work with. So that's the one exception. But for the most part, I like to draft my main characters, figure out what their thing is, and then go from there and build up characters from the main character's own personality, motivations, that kind of deal. And I decide, basically, I know that I want a character that is working in antithesis to the main character. So what personality traits are they going to have that puts them in direct conflict, whether it's physical or more relationship conflict with that character? So I don't really I don't believe in building characters anymore based off the story. I like to do them in relation to the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. So how do you decide on a setting for the story?
For Devil Within Us All, I knew that I wanted it to be small town horror. That novel began radically different. It was going to be more of like a more of a self-contained novel, and it wasn't going to have that theme. And I had the main villain. The main villain stayed the same from the original concept to the new concept, because I felt that the new villain was just such a force of nature and such a good representation of a lot of what's wrong with the world, that I could not subjugate him to just being in this small scope story. So I wanted something that felt a little bit more bigger scale and a lot more threatening, and that's how I came up with The Devil Within Us All. And small town horror is was huge in the 80s and 90s. My favorite novels until I started reading indie horror has always been small town, large cast novels, or at least large cast novels in general. And so I really, really wanted to tell a story like that once I figured out what I wanted to go with. For Man Behind the Door, a lot of the settings are directly inspired by real life. And same with Our Father's Burden. It's going to be with it being camping trip, that kind of deal. It's set in the Appalachian Mountains. It's heavily inspired by my experiences going on those camping trips. But I've submitted a fourth novel. And I'm waiting to hear back about that. Hopefully it's a good fit. If not, but that one is my first novel that I kind of really wanted to tackle a lot more fiction in, I guess I should say. Like my fourth novel isn't quite as inspired by real life as the other three are. And so that one is set in like a rural house near a lake for most of the book. And it's I felt it was a really good representation of like the cosmic horror, small, like bleak area that I wanted to go with. It just felt right based on what I was going with. So,
yeah. Fantastic. So I know you said a couple of the characters were based on your father, and you based the book on there. Did you base any other books on your own experiences or fears, maybe?
I would say not so far. No. I've got an idea for for my fifth book, which I plan to start soon. I've written some key scenes down, that kind of deal, and I'm really excited for that. That's going to be a return to like my own personal experience. But for the most part, I mean, The Man Behind the Door is a lot of me in that book. I would say there's no character that is directly a reflection of me. Two characters that are brothers, I kind of view as an either or. It's like a dichotomy thing. It's something that it's a one path I could have taken or another path I could have taken. It's an extreme version of both that I could have seen my life going if it hadn't gone the way that it did. And so I was so I don't have a whole lot of myself in that book as far as character wise, but some of the fears that the characters experience in that book, one of the two brothers that I mentioned, they both have fears of passing, their father's problems down to their own children. And that's a huge motivation that kind of pushes them back on the path that leads to the climax of that novel. And that was something that I had spent a lot of time thinking about before writing the novel was, am I going to repeat cycles, or at the very least, am I going to pass some unknown gene that I haven't shown yet off to my kids? And so that was probably the deepest, most personal fear I've put in a novel for sure. And then, of course, telling my dad's story through the lens of fiction was very cathartic. That one, there's several scenes in The Man Behind the Door that even to this day, when I read them, it still causes me to tear up. I really bled onto the page with that book because I didn't set out to write a novel. I had no intention of publishing when I set out to write that. I just decided that I needed to write because that's really all I knew how to do. I didn't have anyone really to talk to at the time. And that's, a whole separate thing, but no one I felt comfortable talking about those things too, I guess I should say. And so I decided to put it on page and build fiction around it, because throughout my life, I think that fiction has been a driving force in who I am. The escapism of it and the way that the good guys always manage to triumph over the bad, or even if they don't triumph over the bad, the way that they still stand up against it in the face of the adversity and know what they stand to lose, and it doesn't stop them. And that's been a huge motivation of my life to continue to try to do good in my small section of the world. And so I knew that the best way to process the feelings that I was experiencing was to kind of plug it into fiction and play a character based off my dad against other characters and kind of just get inside of his head to understand a little bit more, I guess.
Yeah, that's, I suppose, did you kind of like use it as sort of like a therapy kind of thing?
It was almost like exposure therapy. I that's honestly how I feel about it. I really don't know a lot about I mean, I know a lot about my dad, but I don't know a lot about my dad. He passed away when I was a teenager. So, and he wasn't exactly forthcoming with a lot of things. And he was just a very quiet, hard man because that's how he was raised to be. He was born in the 50s and his mother was very abusive. And from there, he just kind of compressed everything into this bottle and he never let it out again except in these moments of like turbulent rage. I was really fortunate. He never repeated that cycle with me. I never was abused or anything like that.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of problems and he never found the help that he needed. He never knew how to ask. And so The Man Behind the Door was kind of like my tribute to him. It was telling his story and acknowledging like who he was. My favorite review of that book is from another podcaster. His name is Jody J. Sperling, and he said that he really connected with Lee. He said Lee Glasscock does some truly heinous things in that novel, but he's still the most likable character, and that spoke to me in a way that really no other comment on my work has. I've got a lot of positive reviews on Amazon that compare my work to King. And still to this day, that review is the one that means the most to me because of the fact that that's exactly what I was going for. I wanted to tell a story kind of compassionately, but without bias. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I understood a lot of his actions and I put that to page and I really came through crystal clear, which I'm surprised at for my first book.
Yeah. Sounds like you did really well. Okay, so do you consider yourself a pantser or a plotter?
I prefer to pants for the most part. I do believe that there are some things that an effective pantser has to plot a little bit. Most of my plotting occurs in my head. I'm constantly thinking about my books and stuff like that, and that's how I work through them. But I do believe that like an effective novel, you need to have a couple key scenes to set the tone, so that way you make sure that throughout the novel you know what you're working on. So I usually work with like a Word document that's just like a couple of key notes. That's like, okay, this scene's going to happen this way, this scene's going to happen that way, and I use that to make sure that my tone and pacing stay consistently. With The Devil Within Us All, I tried to pants that novel. I got like 11 chapters in, and I said, hell no, I can't do this. It was too many moving pieces, too many characters. And so that was the only time that I've actually sat down and really fully plotted out a novel before writing it. And it was a different experience, and I'm glad that I did it because it made it a more concise piece. It sits at about 400 pages right now, and it well could have been 600 pages if I hadn't plotted it out and made sure that every scene that's in that novel is working towards the same goal. And I'm so proud that I managed to do that in the middle of it without losing the integrity of the novel or losing the tone. But for the most part, I think that pantsing is the way to go. I know that there are authors out there that are going to listen to this and disagree with me, but I think that Stephen King hit the nail on the head with the statement that the story tells itself. I think that that a really true creative person, it's almost like you're channeling a story from another dimension. It just comes, it flows, and it's an incredible experience. And there are several scenes in each book that I didn't intend to play out the way that they did. A specific scene is very violent at the end of The Devil Within Us All, and it just flowed with no problem. And I was just and it did so much for the main villain and really set the bar for those final couple chapters. And I just was shocked that that's how it went. But it was like I was typing and I was writing, and the scene was escalating, the conversation was escalating, and I just knew that was the way to go with it. And it's a really magical experience. And I think that plotting kind of takes that away a little bit. I feel like if you spend the time to outline a novel really well, you find yourself playing by the rules you've set for yourself rather than just letting the story go its own natural path in some cases. And that's where some of the best plots and scenes are born.
That's right. So are there any exciting projects that you're currently working on that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I mentioned that Our Father's Burden is coming out via Wicked House, hopefully into February. If it doesn't get delayed for whatever reason, it's farther into the calendar, so anything that happens will delay, later books too, and that kind of deal. So whether it's something that goes on with editing cover design or something with a previous book's editing cover design, but right now we're looking at hopefully into February, which is really exciting. I'm glad that we're putting it out quicker than not, and submitted a fourth book to a publisher. I'm hoping to hear back on that in the next couple weeks and see how that goes. I'm really, really hoping that they take it. I'm really proud of this one. And I plan to start working on number 5, which I mentioned it in a reading this weekend, but I'm pitching it as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein meets Pet Sematary. So I'm really excited to get into that one. And that one's going to have a lot of personal stuff in there for me again. And it's going to have a whole lot of heart behind the horror. And that's my bread and butter. That's where I really enjoy writing. And I have Patreon where I do a bunch of short fiction regularly. I'm actually about to finish a novelette that's going to be about 16,000 words long. And so right now, that's like the only place to read the novelette. It's called The Snow Globe. And it's about a little girl who buys this vintage snow globe from a thrift store, and it's got the devil inside. And so it's some of my most extreme horror to date, and it's been a lot of fun to write, and I'm enjoying the different pacing of sharing it as I'm writing it. But it's a really, really neat story and a really cool experience. And it was originally only going to be a very quick short story, and I super quickly realized that there's a lot more to the bones that I could play with.
Fantastic. So what advice would you give to aspiring writers who want to break out into the horror genre?
The really big key, of course, is, everybody says write, and that's 100% true. Writing will get your technical proficiency up. The what I'm writing now is leagues better than what I wrote with The Man Behind the Door. It took a long time and a lot of rounds of editing to get The Man Behind the Door to where it's at, and I'm really proud of that novel. The story is amazing, but the more that you write, the more that you learn, the better your prose is going to get, and the better your word choice, your pacing, all of that. And it's really integral that you just take the time to practice. I will say that if you're struggling to write your first novel, you've always wanted to do it, and you keep going to the page and it's just not happening, think really long and hard. If there is a story that speaks to you, there's a story that you feel like you need to tell. More than often than not, it's going to be personal. And you have to ask yourself, is this a story that I feel comfortable sharing? And if not, maybe it's literally you write it and you never publish it. But I have found that if you can't write that first novel, finding something that you're passionate about and you feel like you need to tell the story about breaks loose those chains. And once you've written a novel, it's infinitely less scary. Once you've hit that 70, 80,000 word mark one time and you've type the end, it's no longer this mountain, because you know how to navigate it, and it becomes less scary and much more enjoyable to do. And so don't give up, keep writing, find that story that really, really, truly speaks to you, and tell it, even if you have no intention of sharing it with the world.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. So lastly, where can visitors find your listeners find your work?
So you can follow me on Facebook. My Facebook profile for my author is William F. Gray. And so you can follow me there. I do pretty relatively regular updates. I have a Substack that you can get to from there that is in my link in my bio. And my Patreon is available there too. And I do recommend, if any of you guys read my work and you like it, I've got everything set pretty cheap. So for $5, you get access to everything that I post on Patreon. There's no barriers beyond that. Anything additional that you would pay for is going to be a really cool perk kind of deal. But for $5, readers get access to everything. I've got pretty much the Snow Globe finished. I've got to be about 10 short stories there. And I'm actually going to be posting a preview of Our Father's Burden in the coming weeks. Probably do like 3 or 4 chapters there to kind of satiate everybody until that book comes out. But I'm really excited to share that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being on the show. It's been a real pleasure having you here, William. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's been a real pleasure being here, and I'm glad that you invited me on and we got to chat about the books and stuff like that. And I'm hoping that, some people hear the words about what to write and how to write and that kind of deal, and it helps some people along the way, because I know that I spent a long time being very upset that I felt like I couldn't write a book, because literature, and especially horror literature, has been a huge part of my life, and has, as honestly as cheesy as it is to say, has probably saved my life on more than one or two occasions. So you guys keep at it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, William.